Rabbi Friedman.
The Rebbe spoke once about the golden calf. Now, the Jews made the golden calf. The Gemara asks, the golden calf used up a lot of gold. And when they decided to make this golden calf, all the men rushed forward and threw their gold into the fire. And out came a golden calf. In order to rectify that, part of the tshuva for having made the golden calf was that God then commanded us to make the Mishkan, which used a lot of gold. The walls were covered with gold, and this was covered, everything was gold. So the question is, the Gemara asks, the question is, where did all this new gold come from out there in the desert? So the Gemara gives two answers. One answer is, it came from the gold that the women had. Because the women did not give their gold for the idol, for the making of the golden calf. When it came to making the Mishkan, the women donated their gold. Another answer the Gemara gives is that even the men who gave their gold for the creation of the golden calf didn't give all their gold. They held back on some gold, and that gold they gave to the Mishkan. What gold is this that they didn't give? So the Gemara uses a very strange expression. The Gemara says there is that fine gold, the best of the best, the golden gold, that people carry with them in their bosom pocket, wrapped in a shmata, wrapped in a cloth. That gold they did not give to the golden calf. When it came to build the Mishkan, then they gave. In other words, there's a certain gold, there's a certain amount of emotion. Gold represents love or fear. There's a certain amount of emotion that is for public use. It's the external. It's even possible that it should end up being given or shared with something as unholy as an idol. But then there's also the private gold, the inner gold. The inner gold we don't squander, and we certainly don't sin with it. It is always reserved for what is holy and good. Even in people who in the other areas of their life are creating idols. That gold is kept in the bosom pocket near the heart. And it's kept wrapped. Which tells us something about intimacy. There is a manner, there's a style in which you treat that which is intimate in order for it to retain its intimacy. What is this manner? What is the style? Modesty. You keep it close to the heart and you keep it wrapped. Then it remains intimate. But if you unwrap it, and if you move it further from the heart, then it becomes part of the public domain. It becomes part of your external gold, and it can end up in the golden calf. And this is where modesty and intimacy come together. In order to be intimate, you must protect the space that is private with modesty. Modesty, then, is not something we do in order to prevent sin. That's a very minimal, a very primitive understanding of modesty. By the way, modesty does not prevent sin. It doesn't work. Some people dress more modest than anyone in America. They even wear veils. That doesn't prevent sin. It just complicates it a little. But it doesn't prevent it at all. what then is the purpose of modesty? The purpose of modesty is to preserve, protect, and delineate the place of intimacy, the intimate place. The reason we have laws of modesty, the reason we have tznius, is not to prevent a person from being too intimate. It's not to prevent a person from being too sexual. On the contrary, it's to preserve a person's ability to remain intimate and to be capable of sexuality. Because when the intimacy goes, the sexuality goes too, at least for sensitive people. It's an interesting thing. People are doing now a lot of studies on child abuse. It's a big subject now, almost faddish. Anybody who can't claim to have been abused really doesn't rate. And what they're discovering is that children, infants, a year old, 10 months old, 8 months old, who were abused physically, sexually, will display certain behaviors similar to those behaviors displayed by children of 6, 7, 8, or 9 years old who were abused. Now the question is, a 7-year-old knows that something went wrong. A 7-year-old is traumatized by what happened. What exactly that trauma is another subject. But at least they're old enough to know that something went wrong. They're old enough to be ashamed. They're old enough to feel guilty. They're old enough to be intimidated and frightened. They're old enough to never trust an adult again. I mean, there are all sorts of things which would explain why they have these behavior quirks. But how is it that a 10-month-old has that same reaction? What does the 10-month-old know about being victimized, about being abused, about being violated? And yet they have the same symptoms. We have to conclude that modesty is very closely related to intimacy. And that intimacy is a native and primal condition. A child is born with an intimacy, with a place that is intimate. And any violation of that intimate place violates the child. Not because they have guilt complexes, and not because they have shame, and not because they have low self-image, but because something private was abused. The private was treated like public. And that damages something. And if you find it difficult to believe that modesty, that tznius, could be an instinctive and essential part of the human psyche, there are animals. In the animal kingdom, there are animals that are modest. There are animals that will not mate in public or in a zoo. Now, if animals can have an instinctive modesty, certainly human beings do. So there is an area that is intimate. We're born that way. It's a given, but it isn't necessarily permanent. It can be damaged. If you take away the curtain, if you take away the shmata, if you unwrap that gold and you expose it, it becomes hardened and callous, and it's no longer intimate. So when God comes along and says, be conscious of the border between the intimate and the non-intimate, and protect it, it's not to prevent intimacy, it's to preserve intimacy. In the Beis HaMikdash, there was the outer chamber that was called the Holies, and then there was the inner chamber called the Holy of Holies. The outer chamber was surrounded by a courtyard fence for privacy, because it is holy, it's sacred, and yet between the holy room and the Holy of Holies, there was a curtain to separate the holy from the Holy of Holies. A higher degree of modesty, another layer of intimacy. What is the difference between the holy and the Holy of Holies? The holy is a single person. The Holy of Holies is a married person. That's why in the holy, in the outer chamber, there could be different Kohanim going in to do the service, to do the work. But in the Holy of Holies, only one. And between the intimacy and the modesty and the sacredness of singlehood, there is a curtain, because the modesty and the intimacy of marriedhood is that much greater that there needs to be a separation. Now, what happens if the modesty has been violated? If the intimacy has been diminished? It can be regained. Because above the Holy of Holies, there was a chamber called the bedroom. There was a second floor. On top of the Holy of Holies, there was a room, and it was called the bedroom. There were no beds there. In fact, the function of that room was that if the walls of the Holy of Holies needed to be repaired, and no one is allowed to go in there except for the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, when he's not allowed to repair walls, and he may not be good at that anyway. So how do the walls get repaired? So they built this almost like elevator shaft on top of the Holy of Holies, and a box with three sides, the open side facing the wall, would be lowered into the room with the mechanic or the mason, and it would be moved to exactly the spot where the wall needs to be fixed, and he would fix the wall and be enclosed from three sides from the Holy of Holies. So he's not really entering the Holy of Holies, which means that this room above the Holy of Holies was the method for repairing any damage to the intimacy of that place. Why was it called the bedroom? If a person has been callous with their intimacy or with their modesty, even in the subtle ways mentioned before, it can be repaired if you start with the bedroom. If you strengthen the modesty where it is most needed, it will heal all the other imperfections, all the other flaws. A lot is said about modesty. Many books have been written about modesty. And usually they talk about people in public places, about people in shul sitting on different sides of the mechitza, about not having mixed dancing. Not enough is said about the modesty that is necessary between husband and wife. I mean, aside from the laws of mikvah, modesty. That a husband and wife should not become callous, that a husband and wife should not lose that space that is shared only as an intimacy, not as a way of life, is so essential that without it, marriages become so unappealing that people have to force themselves to even consider getting married because their mother wants them to be married, because you have to have children. But marriage itself has gotten such a bad reputation that in and of itself it isn't appealing, it's not convincing, it's certainly not compelling. And the culprit there is the absence of modesty. When Adam and Chava in the Garden of Eden ate from the tree of knowledge, from the Eitz Hadas, they suddenly discovered that they were embarrassed by their nakedness. And so they went and got dressed. Generally, as you read that description of the whole story, we read it as the decline of the human race. They could have been perfect, they could have been immortal, they could have remained in the Garden of Eden, but they blew it. And part of the destruction, part of the loss, part of the decline was that they could no longer be natural, they had to wear clothes. That's how it's understood. They were no longer innocent enough to be able to be natural. They had to wear clothes. But that's not a correct understanding of the story. Because after all is said and done, they ate from a tree of knowledge. Not from a tree of evil, not from a tree of ignorance, from a tree of knowledge. So what did they gain from this tree of knowledge? Let's think about it this way. If you were Adam or Eve, created by God's hand on the sixth day of creation, the world is pristine, it is pure, it is immaculate, it is God's creation. When they were first created, they looked at everything in the world and saw it all through one dimension. This is God's world. There were cows and there were pigs. God's world. There were humans and there were animals. All part of God's world. There was light and there was dark. All part of God's world. There was up and down. All part of God's world. There was this divine sameness to everything. How can you distinguish between one thing and another when God himself just finished creating it all? They ate from the tree of knowledge and they gained another dimension. All things are not the same. Some things are deep, some things are shallow. Some things are internal, some things are external. Some things are profound, some things are profane. All in God's world. A very nice little story. The previous Rebbe, as a child, kept a diary. So we have little gleanings of the life of a Rebbe growing up. And one of the most touching little incidents that he describes in his diary is that one time he came home from Cheder and he asked his father, why did God create us with one nose, one mouth, but two arms? Why do we have two arms? His father thought about it for a while, and then he said to him, tell me, do you know the difference between a shin and a sin? The Hebrew letters, shin and sin. And at that time, he was a little boy, he was just beginning to learn the vowels. And he said, yes, he knows the difference. On the shin, the dot is on the right side, and on the sin, the dot is on the left side. The shin, his father said to him, is a strong letter. The pronunciation is strong. The sin is a soft sound. So the dot on the right is a strong sound. The dot on the left is a soft sound. Those dots, his father said to him, are the eyes, the right eye and the left eye. The right eye is a strong eye, and the left eye is a soft eye. The right eye, you look at your fellow Jew with, and the left eye, you look at candies with. With your left eye, you look at candies. So the Rebbe writes that that answer had such a profound effect on him that it uncovered within him an endless reservoir of love of a fellow Jew. And from that time on, I think he was 5 years old, he lost interest in candies. I tried that with my children. I once said to one of my kids, did you ever wonder why you have two eyes? One eye is to look at your fellow Jew with, and the other eye is to look at candies with. He looked at me with both eyes. I didn't know what I was talking about. I'll tell you why. When this boy came home from Cheder and asked his father why we have two eyes, his father didn't make up an answer. He was already, for weeks, maybe months, planning, devising a way in which he can demonstrate to a 5-year-old that there's a difference between deep and shallow. That was the next step in this child's education. So the father was already planning. While the child was away at Cheder, the father was thinking, how am I going to present this to a child so that it's convincing? And the reason that it ended up being so convincing is not because it was cute, not because it was profound, but because it was premeditated. It wasn't merely an answer to a question. It was a father giving of himself to his son. Well, what is the best time and the best way and the best opportunity for a father to share what he wants to share with his son? When the son is asking a question and is open, because he's asking, he is open to what the father had already planned, and the child senses that this is not an off-the-cuff remark. His father had been thinking about it, and that's why it had that kind of effect. It wasn't a father being smart, it was a father being fatherly. That's what had the effect. And what did he say to his son? He said to him, there is shallow and there is deep. That's why we have two eyes. If you don't have two eyes, everything appears to be at the same distance. Everything appears to be flat. When you have two eyes, you can see depth and shallowness. Only instead of presenting it in the physical, that you can see the difference between that beam and the one behind it, his father presented it to him in an ethical, moral setting. A fellow Jew is deep. A candy is shallow. And even as he said that, he practiced what he preached. It was not a shallow remark. It was a premeditated remark. And so coming from an intimate place in the father, it affected the child in an intimate place. Changed him. Let's get practical. If you want to be married, and you want the marriage to be something more than shallow, you got to do something a little bit radical, somewhat radical. There is so much talk. We were talking about this a little bit earlier today. There is so much talk, so much conversation about making relationships work, or working on your relationship. Now that's such double talk. That's such nonsense. When you stop and think about it, what exactly do these words mean when a person says, I am working on a relationship? What are they talking about? What are they saying? A person says, I am working at a relationship. Oh, that's nice. You have any friends? What is this relationship that you're working on? How about the expression meaningful relationship? You got double nonsense. You don't even know what relationship means, but it's a meaningful one. Why do we spend time working on relationships? Where did that come from? What kind of mitzvah is this, to work on relationships? When two people get together, there should be kindness, there should be loyalty, there should be devotion. What's a relationship? What is that? And what are you working at? Relate or don't relate? What are you working at? It has come down to, I am considering taking a calculated risk at allowing myself to become friendly with an individual whom I don't trust. And we're kind of posturing for position. We're digging our foxholes. We're scouting the area. We're calling up the recruits. I'm discussing it with my therapist. My mother is warning me. And so it's a lot of work. I'm working on this relationship. If you want to be married, stop working on the relationship and start taking care of your husband or your wife. It's not a relationship that you need to work on. It's a person that you need to be devoted to. And this posturing, let's see now, if I give in a little bit and I get back a little bit more, then I'm ahead of the game. But what if he turns around and gets back more than I'm getting back? And what do you need this for? What do you need this for? If your intention is to stop being lonely, you're wasting your time. Because the more you work on the relationship, the lonelier you get. And the more tired you get. The more unavailable you become to anybody else, ever. Because after such an exhausting job, and if it doesn't turn out, you're never going to try it again. Why should you? You're a masochist? Be reckless. You want to be married, then get married. You're going to get hurt? I know. Everybody does. Your mother did. So what are you, so precious? Go ahead, get hurt. But get hurt by a marriage, not by a truck. If you're going to have pain, make it intimate pain. The most painful. Now, seriously. If you want to be married, you pick a person who, for whatever reason, appeals to you, and you say, this person I will spend the rest of my life with, making her happy. That's all. That's all. Now, will she make me happy? We'll find out. That's her responsibility, not yours. But if you spend months getting ready for this relationship, and what you're doing during those months is not prevailing on yourself to be completely devoted to this guy, you're spending months trying to convince him to be devoted to you. That's backwards. That's degrading. You do your half. Your half is, I will marry this person and devote my life to making this person happy. That's all. What is there to work on? Chances are that you will experience pain in this marriage. And that's how it's supposed to be. Because if you're going to be intimate, not in the frivolous sense, but in the true sense of the word, you have to be vulnerable. You have to have a place of vulnerability, and then you have to have the courage of inviting another human being into that vulnerable place. How can you not get hurt? But the hurt is intimate. It doesn't violate anything. It doesn't cheapen. It doesn't destroy. It just hurts. And it makes the intimacy that much deeper. When you go through suffering, when you agonize, when you sympathize with another person's pain, with the other person's problem, with the other person's needs, when that person is an intimate part of your life, your intimacy capacity is increased. So, there is no such thing as working on a relationship. You can work out a partnership. You can't work out a relationship. A relationship you surrender to. You don't work it out. You don't negotiate an intimacy. You surrender to it, or you have it, or you don't have it. The people who say, my parents had a horrible marriage. They were fighting, they were crying, they were complaining, they were terrible. I will not. I am smarter than that. I am liberated. I don't have to be married. I won't get married. You're not better. You're not better. You're behind. You don't have the courage. You don't have the confidence to even try. So intimacy requires a surrender, an unconditional surrender. And unconditional surrender means a potential pain. And that's fine. No pain. In fact, this tree of knowledge that gave Adam and Eve their depth, their dimension of the discernment between shallow and deep, came from the tree of knowledge, from the Eitz HaDas. And the Gemara says, more das, more pain. Not computers, das in Hebrew. Because das means a dimension of intimacy and privacy that is vulnerable. The greater your capacity for intimacy, the greater the chance of being hurt. But that kind of hurt is the sign of maturity. It's the sign of Menschlichkeit, not a sign of weakness. On the contrary, the person who cannot afford to risk the pain is a shallow person. What's the pain going to do? You'll crack. You'll be destroyed. They'll never be able to put you back together. The wrinkles on the heart make the heart healthier. And with every pain that is suffered in an intimate and lasting relationship, there's another wrinkle to the heart. It's a mature heart. It's a heart capable of a variety of feelings, not one-dimensional. Therefore, modesty, tznius, becomes not a restriction, not a religious requirement, but a human requirement, necessary to maintain the equilibrium with which God created us, an awareness, a sensitivity that enables us to distinguish between the shallow and the profound, between me and what is not me. It enables me to identify myself so that I am an entity that can share itself with another human being without sacrificing. In an intimacy, the place that is intimate does not become any less intimate. On the contrary. And that's the miracle of marriage. The miracle of marriage is you share the most intimate things on a daily basis and remain completely innocent, unviolated. On the contrary, more private, more intimate, more self. So in a world where men and women work together, are constantly exposed to each other, we need all the more the precautions and the protections that intimacy, that modesty provides. We can't continue to fool ourselves, to deceive ourselves into thinking that we can have platonic relationships. It doesn't work. Sexuality also needs a definition. If we believe that sexuality is something that happens between a man and a woman when they're being intimate, then we're misunderstanding the subject. Sexuality is not necessarily an act. It's a state of being. And that's why, according to Torah, if a man and a woman are alone in a room together and the door closes, that is a sexual event. Not that we shouldn't allow that because who knows what they're going to do in the room. It's not a paranoia over misbehavior. On the contrary, I'll tell you, it is a compliment, and a healthy compliment, when you say to an American man or woman, please don't close the door. We're not allowed to be alone together. That is such a compliment. It's not to prevent misbehavior. It's because being alone together is a sexual event. And I have no intentions of having a sexual event. Or we're not allowed to have a sexual event. Closing the door is sexual. Because aloneness between a man and a woman, that envelops a man and a woman, is sexual. We find ourselves in America in a predicament where man and woman no longer equal sex. Particularly if they're a certain type. That's not natural. When a person says quite proudly, oh, no problem. No, we've been friends for years. Nah, nothing. Nah, I'm not attracted to her at all. First of all, don't tell her. And second of all, what are you proud of? What are you proud of? You've died a little death. What are you boasting about? Oh no, she's not my type at all. Type? Male and female, that's the type. There was this old man who was very ill, and he was bedridden, couldn't take care of himself, and there was an old woman who lived next door who came in and gave him some soup every morning. And he asked his children to please come and spend some time with him and feed him so that she wouldn't have to come. So his son said to him, why? I mean, why should we come all the way from Minsk to Pinsk when you have this woman who feeds you and it's fine? He says, no, it's not tznius. So the son said, oh, come on. You're 88 years old, you can barely move, she's 89. You're sick, she's old. What's the problem? So he said, you don't understand the Yetzer Hara. Don't you know a Yetzer Hara can make me well and her young? And that is a healthy male. That's the definition of sexuality. Male, female. Don't tell me her age. That's got nothing to do with it. That's a healthy human being. That's the way God created us. How we got into this mess. Oh, not that type, and this is to this, and this is to that, and what is wrong with you? Modesty, again, is not meant to prevent sexual misbehavior. We don't have a mechitza in shul to prevent adultery in the aisles. So when people say, what's wrong with you? What do you need this wall for? I mean, what do you expect? What do you think is going to happen? Can't you just go to shul and keep your mind on the prayers? Thank God, no. Would you want to be a member in a congregation where there is no separation between men and women, and the people there do not get distracted and they keep their mind on their prayers? So that if a man is sitting in one of these benches and a woman has to get up and leave early, he doesn't notice it's a man, it's a woman, he doesn't. Would you attend such a synagogue? Synagogue of the righteous. Or the dead. There's another aspect to modesty. Every person is a sexual being. And by the way, these terms, bisexual, heterosexual, it's not a Jewish idea. We don't talk like that. A human being is sexual. And just because you've misbehaved more than one way doesn't earn you a title. A person is sexual, that's it. Now, modesty would mean that in our awareness, in our consciousness of our own sexuality, we do not involve another person either against their will or without their knowing. This is a little bit of a subtle. Everybody agrees that because a human being is sexual doesn't mean that he has the right to involve another person physically in his sexuality if the other person doesn't want. Everybody agrees to that. But there's another form of violation, much more subtle. The other form of violation is involving another person in your sexuality without their knowing. In a secular society, the more you get to know her, the more likely that you're going to get involved physically. In a Jewish society, in an environment that is governed by Jewish values, if you don't know her, then you're capable of fantasizing. But once you get to know her, I mean, she's a human being, then you can't do that. I mean, this is a real human being. It's when it's from a distance, when it's all theoretical, then there might be the chance that you give yourself the license. What harm is it? She doesn't even know. But it is a violation. It's immodesty. You're trespassing on somebody else's borders, and just because they're not home at the time doesn't make the trespass any less of a violation. So tznius would mean not that you control your behavior in shul by putting up a wall. The wall is there because, at least in shul, there should be no violation. And violation can take place on a very subtle level. The three things, modesty, intimacy, and sexuality, are really inseparable. You cannot have one without the other two. Just like the person who is modest and intimate but refuses to be sexual has a serious problem, the same is true in reverse. The person who is sexual and intimate but not modest has a serious problem, and it's not of a religious nature. It's a human nature. Some people are more sensitive, some people are less sensitive by nature. Some animals are instinctively modest, some animals are not. But the human being, the human condition, needs modesty like an animal needs water. Without our modesty, we not only lose some of our dignity, we lose our ability to function in the physical while remaining a mensch. To be able to combine the two, to be physical, to be intimate, and to be a mensch at the same time, modesty is that bridge. Tznius is that bridge. And tznius means no intimacy, no matter how subtle, unless it is intended, unless it is justified, unless it is lasting. If not, nothing at all. What if somebody wants to say, I don't shake hands with women because my mother told me not to touch what isn't mine. That's a very healthy, mature attitude. So instead of frustrating ourselves, instead of running around in circles, instead of becoming less and less capable of intimacy while we look and search and cry and agonize over the absence of intimacy, let's minimize the damage. Let's use the ability to heal the intimacy by starting with modesty, starting with modesty and marriage. Seal off that private place. Become a private individual once again, even as you go through life, meeting lots of people and dealing with lots of people on a social and business basis. But make it very clear that there is a large part of your life that is off limits, public, but totally surrendered to the person with whom you risk spending the rest of your life. And then you have an interesting combination. You have a total surrender, which is a total intimacy, which is a total vulnerability, which allows for a complete merging with the other person. Everybody claims to want that. But at the same time, that the surrender is complete, that the surrender is unconditional, it is very focused. It's not reckless. It's not indiscriminate. And that is the way God wants the world to be. It's the way He wants us to be Jewish. On the one hand, serve God with joy. On the other hand, there are 613 commandments. How can they both how can you be both? If you're going to serve God with joy, shouldn't you be kind of loose and spontaneous and a little reckless? If you're going to have 613 mitzvahs that you have to not only keep, you have to remember. How can you be happy? How can you be joyful with this burden sitting on your shoulder? The answer is, you can't have one without the other. If you become carelessly joyful, you will eventually have no joy. If you become carelessly intimate, you eventually have no intimacy. If you become carelessly spontaneous, you will become so paralyzed, you will become so stilted, that you will be incapable of spontaneity. The only way it works is when the surrender, the spontaneity, the joy is unconditional, but not indiscriminate. If you can focus on that place, on that arena, on that area in your life, which is meant to be intimate, then you can let go. And then you can let go with total abandon. So that a woman married to a man for one day can be unabashedly Mrs. Sharansky. Permanently, profoundly. Calling herself by his name does not diminish her. On the contrary, it's an act of freedom of choice. A freedom of choice that is stronger than communism, atheism, soldiers, border guards, Siberia, prison walls. And although it may be a little bit immodest, and a little out of line, particularly when talking about modesty, every month of those 9 years that she was working to get her husband out of Russia, every month she went to the mikveh, because maybe he'll come out this week. That's an incredible intimacy. That's an incredible modesty.